as I said kind of last time when I did this, and I'll probably start every weekend session with this, all I'm going to be doing here is going through kind of like the minimum tied to the CED. So just make sure you're not just relying only on this, right? But I do want to kind of give you one thing where it's like, let's hit on all the things we make sure we need to hit on as we kind of prepare for May. So that's kind of what my view for these videos is. Hopefully they'll be useful for you as you approach May and as you prepare for the test. So remember that Unit 4 is tied to Unit 3 in the sense that these are happening at the same time, okay? They're simultaneous events. What I mean by that is the period in time that we're talking about is the same, but in Unit 3 we were talking about the land-based empires. If you're looking on here, that's basically the gunpowder empires. Remember, that's the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. Here not really said as that, but anyway. And then also the Russian Empire, which begins at this time, and then you have the Ming into the Qing dynasties in China. These were the big land-based empires. Simultaneous with that, you have the Europeans then starting their own kind of large land-based empires, sea-based empires. But then they end up, taking over swaths of land. So when we're talking about the maritime empires, we're talking about these five right here: Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, which is also the Dutch, which is also Holland. You'll see that kind of a few different ways, and France. Now, the French kind of role in this is probably the least of the group. If you've reviewed anything like any of the Freemanpedia stuff and all that, he kind of goes to great lengths to make that point, that the French are the least kind of important of the group. But we're going to talk about all five of them. But these are the five that you need to know. And this may be a good map. I've got a few different ones for you to kind of see that hopefully kind of give you just different takes on the same deal. But I also want to break these down one by one. So this right here, as you see on the screen, is the kind of at its largest extent the Portuguese Empire. Kind of and their sphere of influence would be the orange on the map, and then there's kind of two different time horizons for the two different shades of red that you see on the screen in front of you as well. I like this one. This is the only one, unfortunately. I pulled most of these from Wikipedia because they all kind of look the same, and I think that's useful as well. But it's also kind of unfortunate because this is the only one of them that shows the connection of the kind of water connection between the empires, which I think is kind of neat to be able to see kind of on the screen in front of you. For each one of these, I've decided to tackle this through this timeline thing that I like to do because I think it's just kind of an interesting way to look at them side by side. Like if you were looking back at these slides, you could look at Portugal, Spain kind of side by side and kind of see how these two states in the same kind of piece of land to an extent in the Iberian Peninsula were competing with each other in this sphere, but how their interactions influence each other, I guess is what I'm saying. But here's kind of an overview of how Portugal gets to this point. So the idea of Portugal more or less starts in 1139, and that's when Afonso I becomes really their first king, declares the idea of an independent Portugal as an idea in the first place, and doubles the size of what is Portugal. Now, from that kind of period to what I'm going, jumping forward like 200 years there, basically Portugal exists, right? I mean, their territory grows a little bit during this time, but then in the kind of mid 14th century, as is the case through a lot of Europe, as we learned about, you have the Black Death kind of devastate all over in Europe, and Portugal was no exception. You had about 1/3 of the overall Portuguese population dies at that point. But out of that, you have this kind of rebirth, which gets us to the period that we're in now. That should say 1420, not 1418. 1420 was actually 1418 is the year of Henry the Navigator's school that was started. 1418 is a different year. 1420 is when they first discovered basically an island away from Europe is the way I would describe it, okay? Now we're talking about just off the coast of Morocco. It's not like they'd reached anywhere near the Americas as yet, but it's kind of the first major discovery by any of these European groups outside of Europe proper. It's kind of in a gray zone of what you would call it a part of, but it's like off the coast of Africa. By 1446, they were colonizing West Africa, so they're really the first ones to get going. That's why we talk about them first, and that accelerates the slave trade a bit. 1494 is an important year because it's when you have the Treaty of Tordesillas, And that's basically when Portugal and Spain together, I'm about to show you a map of this, divide the world and say, well, you take that half, we'll take that half, kind of. There's a few asterisks in there. But that's when they kind of split up the world between the two of them. In 1497 is when the Portuguese make contact with India. Well, 1498 is when they make contact with India. They started the process in 1497. 1500 is when they, quote unquote, discovered Brazil. Of course, there were already people living there, so that's an offensive notion, but that's when they first arrived there. And by 1549, it's made a province, basically, as a colony of Portugal. 1557, they start a colony in Southeast Asia, kind of South China. In 1580, Portugal is actually colonized for a period of time, almost 100 years. Not colonized, conquered for about 100 years by Spain. So there's this brief period of Iberian Union where there's this huge empire when you think about it, because you have the Spanish, which we're about to learn, and the Portuguese empires together at the same time for that window. So for a brief period of time, almost 100 years, they're kind of one and the same with Spain. Although they do still have their own government, they're just under Spain's authority. But then, like it shows there, just almost about 100 years later in 1668, they then become an independent force again. But what you'll find is the kind of the theme here is basically that Portugal and Spain get going first, have an advantage first, particularly in the Americas, but then their influence wanes, and then they're kind of replaced in terms of like global trade by mostly the British and Dutch, and to a lesser extent the French. So that's kind of what the course is here. So by the time you're getting to 1668, yes, Portugal has a big global empire, but then their influence actually starts declining as the French and the British in India, and then also the Dutch in Southeast Asia, start competing with them for dominance. So that's kind of the trajectory of Portugal and how it goes from not existing, basically, to being a trading empire to that trading empire kind of declining to an extent. I'm going to show you this map again because now we're going to go into Spain. So I repeat the maps so you can kind of see their overlays. And what I mean by that is look at, so now I'm going to go back because I think this is useful for you to see. So kind of take a mental snapshot of where you see the Spanish Empire, and then take a mental snapshot of where you see the Portuguese Empire. You might notice that they kind of don't really overlap very much. There's one side's territory and the other side's territory. Brazil's kind of a weird exception, and the Philippines are the exception. Well, that was because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. I thought I was going to show it to you there. Oh, it's after this. Okay, so that's actually, I thought this slide was going to be next, but it's on the other side of it. So I'll talk about it now and go back. That's because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, where they divided, this actually line should be going through Brazil, and it is. This is Brazil right here that you see. But in reality, the Portuguese end up controlling into here. So they're controlling some territory in the Spanish half of the world. But the Spanish as well are doing the same in the Philippines. So the Philippines are technically in Portugal's half of the world, but they control that. So these were the two asterisks that I was talking about, basically the Spanish did control the rest of this in terms of the parts that they did control. In other words, they weren't competing with the Portuguese in this part of the world. And in this part of the world, the Portuguese weren't competing with the Spanish. That was more or less the deal. So this is kind of the story of Spain in the same way. So Spain, as we talked about, was really kind of a few different groups throughout a lot of its history. And then the process of becoming what would become Spain arguably gets started around 1212. And that's when the first time really the Castiles and the Aragons work together in any way. Up until this point, they are rivals. Okay, so they do not like each other. They've been fighting each other. But they end up working together to fight back against the Muslims that were moving in, as you probably remember, that they conquered Iberia under the Al-Andalus. So this is really a turning point because it marks the first time these two groups work together and aren't just enemies. That then accelerates quite a bit by 1469 when those two groups actually merge, when Isabella and Ferdinand marry. And you've probably heard those two names together anytime you've heard them throughout history, and that's arguably because that's kind of how they're seen. And that's really the unification. That's kind of the start of what we would say is Spain happens at that time. 1492 is an important year, as we've talked about, because you have kind of two big events out of Spain that year. Of course, everyone, by now it's been beaten into you about Columbus, so I won't talk about that one too much. But that's the year that the Reconquista of Spain ends. But the point to make is really, at this point here, is when the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula after this point is under the control of Christians, of Catholic forces, be them Portuguese or Spanish. What I'm getting at is most of the peninsula at this point. Then, from this point to this point, when the process is completed, from here to there, most of Iberia is under Spanish or Portuguese control. And then from 1469, those two large sections of Iberia kind of merge, in a sense, into one group, which, like I said, becomes what would be Spain. 2 years after that big year was when that Treaty of Tordesillas that I just showed you the map of happened, when the Portuguese and Spanish basically agreed to divide the world in half. 1516 is an important one because that's when Charles V, who we talked about as the Holy Roman Emperor, became king of basically Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So at this point, then you had, remember I talked about with Spain having France having Spain and then the Habsburgs kind of on both sides of them and how they were surrounded more or less. Well, that's when this happens from the Spanish perspective. That's just Spanish as well. From the Spanish perspective. So that's why it's a significant year, is because at this point then they're in union with the Holy Roman Empire and kind of part of that one empire now, more or less being against the French. So just 5 years after that, I mean, the reason I really like this is because you can see how quickly all these things were happening and kind of how the world was changing all over the place at once, and it was chaos basically. Because just 5 years after that is when you have Spain conquering the Aztecs, and then about 10 years later is when they're conquering the Inca. 1580, as I said earlier, was the year that they take over Portugal, so they enter that period for almost about 100 years where they controlled Portugal as well, but then again, it was 16, whatever it was. Sorry, I don't have all the years memorized as yet, but 1668 that then ended for them. 20 years before that, so this was still under the Iberian Union, is when you had the Treaty of Westphalia. I guess I skipped over. I'll talk about the Spanish Armada in a second. But 20 years prior to them relinquishing control of Portugal is when you have the Treaty of Westphalia, where that basically ends what was called the 30 Years' War. And the big takeaway from that is, up until this point, the Spanish actually had control over the Dutch and over the Netherlands. This is the first time where they recognize independence and that there is a Dutch Republic. So they lose a significant amount of territory, although they didn't really have control over it even at this point. You should know that part in between, though, in 1588 when the Spanish Armada is defeated, mostly by weather, but a little bit by the British. But the big takeaway there is, up until that point, the Spanish controlled the seas. And so after that point is when the British kind of become more dominant. And these things are related because, remember, we also talked about the Dutch having their kind of golden age of shipping and that. Well, that's tied to their relationship with the Spanish in a way, if that kind of makes sense. And then later, with their relationship to the British, once they're no longer under the control and kind of also then protection of Spain. And then the last year that you see there is when the Spanish War of Secession ends. That was in 1715. And basically what the takeaway there is that Spain lost some of their land that was now going to become a part of the Netherlands, so that then furthers the kind of independence and existence of there being a Dutch state, being the Netherlands. We're going to talk about them in a second. They're kind of the most complicated of this group. But what I'm getting at is that Spain lost territory there, and it kind of is the end of that notion of there being one empire in Europe. So essentially, like, that's the end of that idea of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire being kind of one large empire that then eventually might take over all of Europe, was kind of what their ambition was. From that point onward, that's no longer something to be considered. We talked about that already, so let's talk about the Dutch. One thing I want to correct myself with, too, is when I did this presentation earlier, or not this presentation, but in week 1 of Unit 4, I actually said the Dutch West India Company when I meant the Dutch East India Company. So these are the correct letters with the correct names now. So I just want to make sure that I note that error so anyone that was paying attention both times understands that, yes, that was wrong, this is right. So this shows you the Dutch Empire, but remember, as we talked about in class, the Dutch Empire was really a couple companies. It wasn't an empire in the same way that the other states were essentially trying to expand their real territory. I mean, it was, but the difference was that the control was through this corporate mechanism, instead of being expeditions that were being funded by governments to expand the country, essentially, or the state. So this shows you the territory for the two, the East India Company, which was the first, and the West India Company, which was quite a bit later. The East India Company did have the power of war. So what I mean is they were permitted to fight on behalf of the Dutch and engage in conflict, whereas the Dutch West India Company was not. That's tied to an extent to that relationship I was talking about with the Spanish via the Habsburgs. But the result, essentially, really what matters here is the result. The result of that is that they really did not have much success in the Americas. So they had some efforts, as you can see, in kind of South America. This is really a trading presence. This isn't a colonial presence. In North America it was, and in some parts up here it was as well. But what I'm getting at is they just weren't as successful in creating any kind of permanent establishment. Anything that they did create ended up being taken by others very quickly. That wasn't true in the East as much, but like I said, the East India Company had the ability and the power to actually engage in war on its own behalf, so it could defend itself in a way that the West just did not. So this is the same overview, the same kind of timeline look for the Netherlands. So when we say the Netherlands, we mean the Dutch. That's one and the same. Sometimes you'll hear them called Holland. Holland is one of their provinces, basically one of their states. It's the biggest one. It's the most powerful one, so that's pretty much why it gets called Holland. It might be, you might think of it as an analogous to calling the United States America when we are one country on two continents. But we, as the hegemonic power, essentially, we get called America. So it's similar in that way. So the idea of the Netherlands, or the idea of any kind of nationalist Dutch movement, starts in 1433. So from the 11th century to that point, the Netherlands is just part of the Holy Roman Empire, and people that were living there would have said that they were subjects of the Holy Roman Empire. They wouldn't have considered themselves Dutch in any way. That wasn't really, not to say it wasn't a thing, but it wasn't the thing it would become. But in 1433, they enter into this union with the Belgians called the Burgundian Union. And that really begins the notion of there being like an independent Dutch country in the minds of the people that were living there. So before this point, it just wasn't something that, in our shoes today, it's very natural to just think of the world as countries, so everyone's naturally living in a country. The closest thing we can think of for that for these people would have been the Holy Roman Empire, but they probably wouldn't have seen it as the same. They probably would have more identified as residents of their city, perhaps, if you were talking about who they were. So that's why it's a big deal to know that, is because that's when this notion of them being a country and what leads to them becoming a country happens. That really then, that movement gets serious in 1559, when William the Silent, who's also called William the Orange, but there's another person named William the Orange, who I'm going to talk about in a second. So I'm noting this so if you see these things, that these are two different people. These aren't one and the same. They also lived like almost 100 years apart, so that helps as well. But William the Silent was a prince. He was the Prince of Orange, who the other one was also Prince of Orange. But he was Prince of Orange, and he became the stadtholder, which was basically the governor of Holland, Zeeland, which is like New Zealand, but it's Zeeland, and one other important of the Dutch Dutch provinces. And so at this point, he's basically kind of like in charge of the Dutch. All right. Shortly after, under his rule, is when they begin their War of Independence against Spain. That's called the 80 Years' War. The 80 Years' War overlaps with the 30 Years' War. I know this is kind of a lot to take in, but the 80 Years' War, basically the first 50 years are on their own, and the last 30 years overlap with the 30 Years' War, and those two conflicts are the same during that period. In other words, the last 30 years of the 80 Years' War is the 30 Years' War. But anyway, that's this conflict between the Dutch against the Spanish, trying to gain their independence as a state. Okay? Now, like I said, that takes 80 years. Okay? So that's not going to happen until down here. You might notice these two things are 80 years apart. 80 Years' War. It's pretty simple. So in that time, in between, is when the Dutch East India Company, Dutch West India Company all get started. Now, circle back to what I was saying before. This one had the power to fight people, basically, because they weren't really engaging with Spain. This one here did not have that power, okay? So, but they were still founded, both of these really, but more so this one, to counter Iberian dominance. What I mean by that is Spain and Portugal together dominating trade. This is what I mean about the early part of this period being dominated by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then you're going to see that kind of change, and later in the period is when the Dutch and the British, and to a lesser extent the French, then kind of step up and fill that void, or really take that void. When we talked about the ships, and we're going to talk about them again in a second here, but I had mentioned that one advantage that the Dutch really had was that they were able to kind of mass produce these ships and do it at a cheaper rate. So not only were the ships that they built, the flutes, kind of superior in terms of what they could carry, but they were cheaper to build, and they were building them in a quick scale. The Dutch weren't just doing, they weren't just innovative in that way. They were innovative in agriculture, they were innovative in financial devices and financial strategies and approaches, and just industry generally. So in various different ways, they basically built this advantage in terms of technology, in terms of knowledge, and in terms of like markets, to just kind of gain advantage over their rivals in Europe. They also benefited from where they were. They're kind of in the middle of everything. So you had a lot of important trade going through them because of their position literally just in the world. The reason I'm kind of saying all this is because this is kind of a neat year to know, and you may have heard before about this, the tulip bubble in the Netherlands, but basically tulips became a status symbol in the Netherlands. And I mean tulips, the flowers. And there was intense demand for them, and the price of tulips just got to an insane amount. And I should actually have these numbers here, and I don't. That may be a slide I added as well, because that would be kind of a funny thing to look at. But the point is, you have the first stock market crash ever that happens as a result of people overestimating the value of tulips, and tulips becoming worthless overnight because the economy collapsed as a result. Now, it was brief. The economy rebounded very quickly. They had this trade dominance, remember. So, like, this was just a momentary blip that didn't really matter too much. But the reason we tell the story is because it kind of marks the start of speculation in markets. Basically, the idea of people being able to bet on financial outcomes in a way to generate a profit, and that then having an impact on the movement of capital and wealth across the world. So the reason I list that as a year there is because it's important as an important event, basically, in global capitalism. And so that's why it's one you should probably know. So just like we had on the Spanish slide, 1648 is an important year because it's not only the year that they lost a bunch of land, it's also the year that the Dutch gained the land that they had. So from their perspective, the Treaty of Westphalia was a success. Just 4 years later, they founded a colony in South Africa. And so that's the start of their colonial presence in Africa. And then they gained further territory in Northern Europe in 1715. Same deal, same interaction with the Spanish that we talked about. So that's, you can kind of see this from both sides, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in their relationship with each other. This here shows you the British Empire kind of at its largest extent. Granted, they really did have control of India for some of this, even though they only had territorial control over some parts of it. And then, of course, we are probably well aware by now of their presence in North America, and maybe to a lesser extent in South America and Africa. But before we talk about their timeline, I want to talk about, well, what do we mean when we say Britain? Because this is something it's important that you guys know. And this is the same idea shown 3 different ways. Okay, so it's the same thing. Don't think these things are in conflict. These are all the same exact idea. But basically, when you're talking about the British Isles, you're talking about everything. Okay, I wanted to do it down here, but I'll do it down here, or up here rather. So you can see at the bottom down there, that blue circle. When you're talking about the British Isles, or you can actually see it here as well, we're talking about everything, the lot. All right, Ireland is this island right here, but the country of Ireland is only the green part that you see here. Okay, because the northern section, Northern Ireland, is technically part of the United Kingdom with Scotland, England, and Wales. All right, so you can see over here, that's what this is, okay? But if we're just talking about just the island, this island here, the one that's next to Ireland, so this is Ireland, the island, this is Great Britain. And Great Britain is made up of England, Scotland, and Wales. So it's a little complicated, but it's actually not really that complicated. It's kind of funny. It's like once you kind of get it, it's pretty simple. But when we're talking about Britain, we're kind of talking at this point about Great Britain being, let's say, this island here, because you'll see on the timeline they're in union for a fair chunk of it. Okay, so the kind of modern notion of Britain then is going to kind of get started in a similar way. I give you the origin for each of these. 1066 is probably a year you've learned already. That's when William the Conqueror becomes the first king of England. Or no, sorry, not the first king, sorry, but the first king of what kind of is the modern notion of England. So that's the distinctive point here, basically. That was the result of the Battle of Hastings, which was the last invasion of anyone successfully into Great Britain. So there's no more outside influence from Great Britain from 1066. From that point onward, they are a state, if you want to call them that then kind of flips that narrative and starts then exerting their influence on the rest of the world. That's why it's an important year to know. In 1215 is when the Magna Carta was created, and that was the kind of turning point in the power of kings. Brought the king, I guess is what that should say. Brought king under. Brought the king or brought kings. Brought kings under the control of law. Okay, brought them under the law. So that was the end of any movements towards absolute rule in England, was the Magna Carta. It also guaranteed some rights, but mostly for the rich. Their exploration begins in about 1497, so not too far after. We're talking 1492 with the Spanish, Portuguese a fair bit earlier. But their explorations at this point were really going to be limited to the northern parts of North America. So that's why they're not, necessarily seen as much of a power early on, is because they were active, but they weren't very far afield. And that's mostly because of the dominance of the Spanish to their south. Remember, the Spanish were the dominant naval force until the defeat of the Armada. 1534 is an important year to know because that's when the king or the queen of England was made. It was at that point was a king, but whoever the monarch of England was, not the Pope, became the head of the church. So that's kind of the start of the breakaway from the Catholic Church for them. 1580 is an important year because that's the first year that Francis Drake circumnavigated the world. In other words, went around the entire world in one trip, and he did that he left in 1577. So the full trip took about 3 years. 1600 is the East India Company, so that kind of gives you an idea of the overlap. If we go back to the Dutch real quick, so there's 1602 and 1621 were the 2 years. So they actually follow the East India Company slightly, but the structure was very different as well, because the East India Company that was started by the British was still kind of, the control of it was not, it wasn't not to say it was government controlled, but the same powerful elites were kind of in control of both of them in a way that the Dutch companies basically became their own entities and were not very well controlled. The East India Company was never not really a controlled entity. That's what I'm really getting at there. But for the first 100 years or so, the whole reason it existed was only to expand trade. It wasn't a colonial force until about 100 years after its existence. 20 years after that is when you have the Mayflower come across, and that's kind of the start, let's say, of mass migrations from Great Britain to the Americas. And so this, as I showed you there, so it's 86 years after the East India Company started is when the British start trying to colonize India. They are not successful at first, but that's when they begin their efforts. And then 2 years after that, actually, is when the other William of Orange, the one that's actually known kind of only as this, and so he was also a Dutch leader. He conquers Britain in what was the Glorious Revolution. It was a bloodless revolution where basically he was invited to conquer Great Britain by some members of Parliament and invaded with a force and was not resisted and kind of just took over. So it was a Glorious Revolution, bloodless revolution. There's kind of different names for it. But he's the other William of Orange that you might see. But those are two different people. So William the Silent was Prince of Orange. Well, William the Orange was also Prince of Orange, just like I said, about 100 years later. And then from 1707 is when you have the kind of merging of England and Scotland. So before this point, you already have the merging of England and Wales, but you have the merging of England and Scotland into one country that becomes the United Kingdom. So up until this point, they are two separate countries that were still under the one monarch, but they kind of manage their own affairs. Now they're under one government, basically. So this is the same idea for France, but I want to point out that all of the stuff you see in yellow was either before or after. So all I'm trying to point out is that the time period we're in right now, the colonization of Africa and the colonization in the Americas that you see there will not take place in this window. So I just want to make sure you know that. But that's the extent of the French Empire at its largest extent. Note what it says at the bottom there. This map is anachronous. In other words, this map does not show you any one point in time. It shows you at the largest point in time. So what I'm getting at is when they had control of this, they did not have control of this. Okay? That's all we're getting at. So I wanted to do the same thing I just did with Britain, but I wanted to kind of show you afterwards because I want you to see the overlay. So the next one I go to is not going to have the yellow, so to not confuse you too much. But take like a mental snapshot, and then take a mental snapshot. You might notice the same deal that we saw with the Portuguese and the Spanish. It's basically like the lines overlap with each other. So if you were to like look at the green when I go back, imagine how that fits right into this pocket. And here, there is some overlap here, but I think it's because of the way that they're kind of showing this, and in time it may be a little different as well. But most of what is the French Empire is going to be kind of back around here. So they, in a similar way, have that kind of splitting, although India is kind of a special case. But I just thought it was interesting to see how you can actually, when you look at these maps from a kind of a side-by-side perspective, you can actually see the way that they were dividing the world up essentially amongst themselves. So let's take the same little journey for France. So France, the notion of what is France probably gets started around 987. That's when you have the Capetian dynasty that begins, and they're going to rule France for about 300 years. And France will be under a monarchy all the way from here. Well, actually, no, they're under monarchy from before this point. But that's when the monarchy that was ruling throughout was there. So from slightly before this point, they're under monarchy all the way until the end here. That's all I wanted to say, is it's kind of the one contiguous thing, which is just kind of unique. And most of these countries had a whole bunch of different governments in this time, as we've been talking about. That was not true of France. So France had stability in the one sense, but then had quite a bit of pressure from external forces that to an extent explain its lesser importance as a colonial and exploring power at this point in time. They will be later, but right now they're just really not. So the first kind of years we get into our time period, you see that's a big jump, but that's just because, again, there's not really, it's not to say there's nothing to talk about, but there's not much to talk about in terms of their existence as a global trading empire. So I'm going to skip kind of ahead. 1453 is when the 100 Years' War ends. Remember, the 100 Years' War is not 100 years, but 117 years. But the important thing to understand is during the course of that conflict, which has been going on for the 117 years prior to this, France loses 50% of its population. Not just through war. Remember, there was also a plague, so it's not just the war. But what I'm getting at is it sets them up to not really be as powerful as the others. So as you see as you saw Portugal and Spain kind of taking off in their global empires, their trading post empires, and then the British and the Dutch, in a similar way but slightly different, do their thing. The French just didn't have the capacity for it, but it's because they enter this period in a disadvantaged state, essentially, because they had just had a huge population decline because of multiple things fighting against them, essentially. That being said, only about 80 years after that, they had recovered to the point of being able to sponsor voyages across the across the Atlantic. But think about this another way, that's about 40 years after the British started. Okay, so they're essentially doing the same thing the British were doing, but about 40 years later. But again, if you take the fact that they had just lost half of their people into consideration, it kind of makes sense. About 70 years after that exploration begins is when they start their first colony in what we call modern-day Canada and Nova Scotia. 1624, they start trading posts in West Africa. 1 year later is when they started settlement, and then shortly thereafter a colony in what's modern-day Haiti. That's going to become very important as we get into the next unit. 1664, so 64 years after the start of the British East India Company. But remember, the British East India Company doesn't start trying to colonize until the 1680s. So about 20 years before that happens is when the French East India Company is created to basically compete with the British and Dutch in South Asia. Okay, because at this point now they've taken over South Asia, because before this point that trade was dominated by the Portuguese. So the Portuguese dominate it, then the British and Dutch come to dominate it, and the French want to be involved in that as well. At this, not the same time, but around the same time, so about 25 years later, is when you have that pressure, as I was talking about, from all sides on them. Okay, so that's when you have the Grand Alliance, which is this grand anti-France alliance that gets created between the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, and the Austrians. Remember, the Spanish and the Austrians are united under that Habsburg alliance. So that puts a huge amount of pressure on France, and once again, as I'm trying to kind of make a recurring theme here, puts pressure on them that it kind of explains why they were not necessarily able to be as successful out in the global world competing as their peers, because they had quite a few things working against them. But that being said, think about this. They have all of these countries working against them. Still, 10 years later, their control of territory in the Americas stretches from basically all of eastern to central Canada along the southern part, all the way down through the rest of North America to the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana. So it's pretty impressive what they were able to create, but you also have to understand that what they did create in North America was not as densely populated as what the British were doing to their east along the coast, and that plays a big role in the success of the British and then later what would become the country we're living in. So it's just kind of interesting to see how those things kind of pan out. I only note this year, I know it's outside of our window, but it's just because it's an interesting point to make, that monarchy had existed all the way back to the 9th century. So in a sense, they were incredibly stable, but in a sense, they were also clearly not. This shows you the kind of European settler colonies, trading post presences across the world during this period, essentially. So most of these are some form of company. That's why you can see this is chartered European monopolies over specific areas. But basically, the trading rights or the trading control over a specific area would get granted or controlled by a specific group, and that's how they were administered, basically. So this shows you each of the different countries that were involved and kind of what their symbols are and where they were. You can see that there was conflict here, okay, and basically the course of how this worked was the Portuguese were first. So the Portuguese had kind of trade dominance, especially along the western coast of India, but then they just get replaced by the dominant British naval force, and so then they have that. But the French established their presence on the other side, and then eventually they end up taking over kind of most of the subcontinent from the British. But remember, in both instances, neither ones are necessarily even in like territorial control. It's more like hegemonic control. It's more like influence control at this point. But one thing you might note as well is beyond having just a couple, this is where Hong Kong is, by the way. Beyond just having a couple like city presences close to China, you might notice that up here there's nothing, and that's because China and Japan embraced an isolationist stance, which we'll talk about in just a second. This is the last slide of this first part, and this is straight from the Freemanpedia slides, but I like it because it shows you all of these things side by side. So some of these things now, like, this should make a lot more sense to you than probably the first time you saw it. That's all I'm trying to say. So when we're talking about the gunpowder empires, these are up here, okay, the Ottomans and the Safavids. The Mughals are not, they're down here, but anyway. So you can see how they were concurrent. So the Ottomans are controlling during this whole time, right? So they're a presence this whole time. The Safavids come in there. That's who's in control of China over this period. That's when the Tokugawa take over. But what I'm getting at is you can see how those people we already talked about, oh, and the Songhai as well. The Songhai were earlier, and their influence wanes as gunpowder moves into Africa. Remember, that was a big part of their decline. But anyway, all I'm getting at is these were all concurrent and really slightly before. So when we're talking about the Ottomans and the Safavids for sure, not the Mughals actually though. They're slightly kind of before the empires that get started of the Portuguese and the Spanish, but pretty quickly these European empires and then the French and British, as you see later, are going to become the more powerful. So it's just kind of interesting to see how that, I guess, how those timelines overlap and how these things, who these groups were that were bumping into each other in different parts of the world. I'm not moving the mouse now so you can actually see the bottom part in Southeast Asia. But once again, Portuguese have their dominance first, and then the Dutch kind of come in. The Spanish, it's interesting because the kind of current dominance there is, again, the Philippines is what we're talking about there. So now I'm going to approach this from the CED perspective. But I wanted to go through the states first because I think that that's a useful kind of it's useful context essentially for you to understand the unit that we're in. So that's why I start there. Just like every other time we've done this, I just want to remind you of the themes and the fact that as I talk about these things, you're going to see the little theme boxes up in the top. I haven't done the Spice T chart yet. I've started the process, but it's still kind of bewildering me what the best way to do this is. And I don't want to do it and then redo it. Not because I don't want to do it multiple times. I don't want to be confusing for you guys. So I will be posting them, but only once I've really got my head around, do I want to do Unit 1 as one thing or do I want to separate it out? Because I can convince myself of both in a moment, and that's not really good for making a decision. So we don't have the Spice T chart, so I do want to pay a little bit more attention to these slides than we might do normally. When we look at 4.1, it's also only 4, so that's also probably a good reason to do it. The question that we're being asked, or the learning objective that we're talking about, is to be able to explain how cross-cultural interactions resulted in the diffusion of technology and how that diffusion then basically changed the way people behaved. Some of the points or the key concepts that support that learning objective are basically, you're good, no worries, Mario, are basically that knowledge from various groups found their way back into Europe and then were improved upon, and then also that ship design in particular had a big influence on this. And then your kind of illustrative examples are the things we talked about, and I'm just going to go through them kind of again quickly, but this is not exactly the same as what we talked about in class. It's like a condensed version of it. But the takeaways here are that classical knowledge, being Greco-Roman, Islamic knowledge, and Asian knowledge, spread and then find their way back into Europe where they're more or less improved upon. Some of the developments that you need to understand are that people were better at understanding global wind and ocean patterns, they were better at making ships, and they had better, basically, tools of navigation, be it compasses and astrolabes or star charts or maps. All of these things come together to just completely change the way that the world was structured and the way humans were behaving. Okay, we talked about the movement of food during the Columbian Exchange is a big thing, but that's just one example. I highlight it here because it's probably the most important one, but there were quite a few is all I'm saying. So I'll start with understanding the environment. Again, this should be a review for you guys. As people understood the way that tides worked, the way that ocean currents worked, and the way that wind patterns worked, they were better able to navigate, they were better able to sail across the world. It's a pretty simple kind of concept to grasp. As we were better at doing it, we did more of it, basically. All right? And so that escalation is critical to what would come next. There could not be a global trading empire, and there could not be colonization, and there could not be then global empires that then would follow. Understand that that's the kind of order in which this happens, by the way. It starts with the trading empire, then becomes colonization, then becomes a global empire. Like, that's the kind of 1, 2, 3 order of this. None of that is possible if these technological advances don't take place. If all of these technologies don't get developed out in the world and then come together in Europe at this point in time and get used the way that they are, and some of them improved, that none of what follows happens. So this is how I would break down the innovations that happen. It's basically better tech, better tools, and better charts. So the technology we're talking about are the ships and the sailing technology. So they use triangular lateen sails. They were better at capturing wind in light wind situations, which meant you could travel and you could sail in a wider variety of situations. Remember, these allowed them to sail windwardly. In other words, they could sail toward the wind, and that was revolutionary. The ships improved. You need to know about the caravel, the carrack, and the flute. We're going to talk about them in a second. You should also know about the galleon, which is just a carrack with guns. It's not, nothing too complicated. And the takeaway here is that bigger and better ships meant more and more people and cargo could be on them, which meant more trade and meant more travel. There were better tools, so the compass, which was a Chinese invention, finds its way to Europe, and is improved around the year 1300 when they start mass producing what are called dry compasses. Up until this point, it was hard for them to mass produce them. That made it hard to be a tool that was used by many people. Once they could make a lot of them, they could. Remember, those early ones pointed south as well. Another tool you should know about is the astrolabe. That was a European invention that finds its way back into Europe after being improved by Muslims. I don't know why I put other groups. I could just put Muslims. So I don't want to take anything away. I'll change that slide as well. The charts that were used improved. So there's astronomical charts. Hopefully that's pretty simple. It just means a chart of the stars. Sorry, it's a hard thing to say. That they used to navigate where they were, traveling in the ships. But also better maps. Obviously, as more and more exploration was happening, the quality and the amount of content in the maps increased. But equally important is the printing press, which allowed them to mass produce the maps. So just like the mass production of compasses was a big deal, the mass production of maps became a big deal because you needed these things to be able to do all the traveling that you could now do on these better ships. I hope you get what I'm saying. It just, all of these things come together. So you see down there, it's like a math equation. Better navigation plus better tools equals more efficient trade and travel. So more of it happens. Here's the ships you need to know. Caravels, they're the smaller ones, more maneuverable. They were used by European explorers quite a bit. They relied almost exclusively on lateen sails, which allowed them to travel toward the wind. And remember, the Nina and the Pinta were caravels. The carrack is the next one to know. Okay, they're slightly after, but kind of concurrent. And they're used for a different thing. Okay, they were larger, so they could carry more stuff. They became the preferred ship for trade as a result of that over caravels, and the Santa Maria was a carrack. Remember, galleons, I'm going to talk about them in the middle. Galleons are just carracks with guns. Some of them had quite a few guns. And those ships were used by the Spanish Armada. Well, by the Spanish Silver Fleet and also by the Armada. But what I'm getting at is they were very important to the trade dominance or the maritime dominance that the Spanish Empire had, was having those armed carracks at their disposal. The last ship to know about, again, is the Dutch flute, named as such because of its shape, its fluted shape. You can't see it on this picture, but you could on the other. You can to an extent, I guess, but it basically is very rounded at the bottom, so it's more of a flat bottom, and that allowed it to go into much more shallow water, which was advantageous. The design of it also allowed for much more cargo to be in there. It was about twice as much cargo as a carrack and cost about half as much to build. That's the old kind of cliche that you say with it. But it cost less to build because it was mass produced. The Dutch built giant shipyards so they could pump out a lot of these. By 1670, they were carrying half of all European trade in these things. Okay? I know last time I said it was about a third of all European goods, and that's true, but that third of goods was representing about half of all the trade. So this ship and the ability to make a lot of them cheaply is one of the biggest reasons that the Dutch had the trade dominance that they had, in addition to their innovations in other areas like we talked about. So let's go through this real quick. So the learning objectives on this one, there are two. The first one is to be able to describe the role of states in the expansion of maritime exploration between the period that we're talking in. And the idea is basically just that that there were state-sponsored explorations that went on at this time. And that's what I was talking about earlier, about how you had the Portuguese and the Spanish and the British engage in a lot of it early. The Portuguese first, but the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British all had very large state-sponsored exploration activities going on. The Dutch did not as much to an extent, because remember, their activities were corporate. They had companies doing the exploring, basically. The French efforts were also mostly state-sponsored, although not entirely. We talked about the French East India Company and the British one as well. But remember, they were later and they didn't do as much of it. Okay, so the three really big ones that engaged in state-sponsored activities were the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British. But also remember, the sphere of influence for the British was a lot less than the other two at this point. The other learning objective is talking about the economic causes and effects of all of this exploration by the European states. And here's where they break it down into the different groups. So the Portuguese, yes, as we talked about, get going first. They have a school that's founded by Prince Henry the Navigator, and they basically invest actual resources and actual energy in improving their technological and navigational capacity toward this, and that's why they were successful in it first, essentially. All right, but in terms of the Americas, that's when we turn to the Spanish, and that's the second. That's key concept 4.1.3.b that you see at the bottom there. And so Spanish sponsorship of Columbus's voyages and the ones that followed were really the thing that got global exploration growing. So that's kind of the point to make between these two different states, is that the Portuguese get going first, but they don't really go as far afield. The Spanish then enter the game, and they start exploring very, very far afield. Okay, and so that's their role in the piece. But then after them is when you see the French, the English, and the Dutch. I kind of said them in a bad order there. But they enter the game. But as it says there, and don't miss that last line there at the bottom, which you'll see again when I stop moving the mouse. They were doing this to basically find a way around the Portuguese and the Spanish, because the dominance of the Portuguese and the Spanish was annoying for them, essentially. And so that they were trying to find a way to these vital trade networks without having to deal with enemies. So why did Europeans explore? Well, they explored because they were competing with each other. They were competing over trade, over resources, people, and knowledge. Remember, this was during the same time as the European Renaissance. So you have this reawakening happening. You have a prioritization of knowledge in the person happening all of a sudden. And that renewal of knowledge and learning in no small part was related to all the exploration that started going on. In other words, you wouldn't have had one without the other. If you didn't have that rebirth of knowledge, it's hard to imagine these states then sponsoring these grand voyages, right? But in the context of the moment, it makes a little bit more sense. Remember the 3 Gs, God, Gold, and Glory. That's the simple kind of historian way of saying why they were doing what they were doing. But they were just competing with each other. Like, it's as simple as that. It really is. As exchange grew, more and more people, plants, and animals found their way across the world, and you had the spread of foodstuffs from different parts of the world, but remember, you had disease as well. The Portuguese and the Spanish, again, were the first to sponsor these expeditions, so you should know that. And then the British, Dutch, and French followed, and the British and French especially then engaged in settler colony activity in the Americas. So this comic is meant to kind of explain to you or give you an example of what mercantilism means. But basically at this time, European states saw themselves in competition with each other. They saw themselves as competitors in a game where there was a finite supply of stuff, and you had to take as much of that stuff as you could take before someone else did. Okay, so that's what this whole idea here about the gold and silver and the food and the raw materials, all the stuff coming back to the colonies, or sorry, from the colonies to the mother country, that was rooted in this idea that all of these states were competing with each other, and that there was only so much stuff in the world, so they needed to do so, otherwise they would fall behind. Okay, they felt this drive to compete because everyone else was, essentially. So that's mercantilism kind of in a nutshell. I like this map because it gives you years for these things, so you can kind of see how the Portuguese, you see a lot of 14s, right? And the French, you see 15s. England, actually, you see some 16s, but also some 14s, so they were a little bit all over the place. But I like the ability to see the different years, and you can also see these are the lines for the Treaty of Tordesillas. So that shows you the splitting of the world. But remember, the Philippines are at this point Spanish, and over here is also Portuguese. This is the same map, but Freemanpedia-ified. I just like to give you both looks so that way you can kind of have that consistent look throughout the process. But again, these are the good thing about the way he does his maps is they're tied to the AP curriculum. So like each thing you see here is definitely an AP thing. Everything you see here is something straight out of the CED. So that's why I like showing you these things, because there's not much noise outside of it. But at the same time, it's kind of limiting then because it's only approaching this from the AP's perspective or from the CED's perspective. So anyway, it's just the same map in another look. So it probably felt like I went kind of quick over that, but it's because there's not really a lot to understand, right? Like I said, the reason Europeans were exploring is because they were competing with each other. The Portuguese did it kind of first, the Spanish shortly thereafter, and then the Northern Europeans got involved later on. It's also maybe worth noting that that's a similar trajectory to the way the Renaissance moved. In other words, it was in Southern Europe first and then moves north. Granted, it was Italy mostly, but my point is it kind of, you can kind of see the two of them together. So now I'm going to talk about the Columbian Exchange. We did talk about this in class, but again, I'm going to review in a consolidated way. But we're going to talk about the causes of the Columbian Exchange and some of its effects. And then really everything else from there are just key concepts that support that. So in other words, the new connections between the hemispheres led to an exchange of stuff, colonization activities, further. So let's use an analogy here. This right here is like a little spark that begins, right? There's a little fire. And then this is a bunch of fuel that gets poured onto that fire. In other words, you have like a little bit of exchange happening as the Europeans start going across. But then as they start moving huge groups of people, and I think it was probably about 2 million people from Spain moved to the Americas, as an example. As those people moved, a lot of stuff went with them. And so that then just rapidly accelerates this process, is all I'm trying to say there. Foods moved both directions. So you had fruit trees, grains, and sugar and animals being brought to the Americas from Afro-Eurasia. You had food like corn and potatoes and tomatoes finding their way back across from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia. And particularly in Afro-Eurasia, as we're going to talk about, you had the growth of populations as a result of all this. So pretty simple. The cause was people moving, and the effect was stuff moved. I mean, it really is that simple, but obviously then understanding what that stuff was is the nuance here. So we went through the same table in class, but basically these are the things from the CED's perspective that you need to know about. Plants that moved from Europe to the Americas were fruit trees, grains, sugar, and coffee. Remember, coffee is an African plant, but it was moved there by Europeans. The Europeans brought horses and cattle, which changed the way agriculture and travel and all of that was being done. And pigs were a significant source of calories and food in the Americas. So that all of those had pretty positive impacts. The disease did not. Enslaved Africans brought with them okra, rice, sorghum, and varieties of melons. And then the foods that found their ways back to Afro-Eurasia from the Americas were things like corn, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, and sweet potatoes. All of those then spur this huge population growth in the rest of the world at the same time as the Americas start dying rapidly from all the disease that was brought there. So it's just, you have a very different result on both sides of the planet, basically, is all I'm saying. So the Columbian Exchange, again, is just that transfer of biological information, of biological material from one part of the world to the other that happened during the 15th and 16th centuries. And we call it the Columbian Exchange because we roughly mark it as starting with Columbus's voyage. It did not start with Columbus's voyage. Obviously, there was stuff going on before this. We just talked about it. but that's where the name comes from, is from Christopher Columbus. So the impact on the Americas, like we talked about in class, disease. People died in tremendous numbers, okay? It's from some areas 50%, other areas 75%. You had that simultaneous with fighting with the Europeans. The impact on the Americas was devastating. Now, remember, like I said, the College Board wants you to understand that was not intentional. That was not something that the Europeans did to try to, like, drop the populations. No one understood that they were bringing diseases with them. But they brought things like mosquitoes and rats that helped things like smallpox, measles, and malarias spread all through the Americas and have devastating impacts on certain populations. There's a map there, not map, there's a chart there that shows you one population in Mexico as an example, but this was happening all over the place. So basically you have, simultaneous with that, foodstuffs going to the rest of the world that causes a booming population elsewhere. Those booming populations then start colonizing back where you are. You can kind of see how that happened. I mean, really, it kind of makes sense that you have the populations die off in the Americas. You now have these big, not empty, but becoming less full continents ripe for settling, and that's what happened. So food crops are how the population grew. That improved not just nutrition, but also food diversity. And then, as I said, as the Americas were settled, they relied on coerced and enslaved labor to engage in the agriculture that went on to support the large amounts of food that were being sent back, and other raw materials as well. Some of those raw materials were cash crops, things like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and all of these things were then being exported to Europe and the Middle East. In terms of the impact on Africa, remember the population does go up during this time because of all the new great food that came in, but in certain areas that certainly was not true. That was not true because of the Atlantic slave trade that began. Basically, you had about 10 million people, thereabouts, that got brought across against their will to the Americas. Or sorry, about 12 million people, not 10. Sorry, I saw the pop up there and it kind of distracted me. So about 12 million people brought across from Africa to the Americas against their will, and that's one side of the triangular trade system, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So I'm rushing through this part because you've seen this already, so I don't want to belabor the stuff you've seen as much. All right, so this is the last of the topics, okay? So this is it, and then you'll be on your way. But this is also the largest of the topics, so I kind of want to take my time with it as well. So this one, remember, after the first learning objective is going to focus on continuity and change, but let's talk about this first. So explain the process of state building and expansion among the various empires that existed. In other words, what were they doing? Okay, in this part of the world, what were those European states that were engaged in this part of the world? How did they go about what they were doing? And then the key concepts that are tied to that are here, that basically they established trading posts across Africa and Asia. Those were mutually beneficial. In other words, the local rulers benefited, they became more rich, and the mother countries became more rich because they were sending stuff back, okay? But the next part here I want you to make sure that you understand is that a lot of these, like these trade networks that existed in the eastern coast of Africa and South Asia, already existed. Remember, we just learned about the Indian Ocean trade networks, okay? So all of this stuff already existed. The Europeans enter a game that's already being played, essentially. But they have a profound impact on that game. Remember also that these empires were being formed because of the rivalries that existed between these 5 groups of people. Okay, we've said that a few times, but they can't reiterate it enough. And then, like I talked about before, parts of Africa did benefit. There are 2 kingdoms in particular. The kingdom of Kush, oh my God, that's ancient history. The kingdom of Congo and the Asante Empire, or sometimes you'll see it as Ashanti Empire, that benefited from their participation in trade networks with the Europeans. Then when we go over here, the other 2, like I said, are tied to continuities and change. And really what they're talking about in both of them is economic and labor systems, but then at the bottom talking about how that then influenced social hierarchy and social order. And this is another part of the areas where I plan on adding a few more slides. So when we go back to when I was talking earlier about the navigation and the exploration activities, I'm probably going to add some there. This is the other side where I'm probably going to add a few as well, because I think there's a little bit more that we could get into here. But what those systems are basically, well, let me step back. Again, this right here reiterates the point we made over here, that these trade networks already existed, okay? So this was just Europeans entering a system that already was functioning, but they did influence it. Then in the Americas, what you saw happening was the movement of some European labor systems that were already existing, and then also the adoption of some local labor systems as well, and then the inclusion later on then of chattel slavery and the actual ownership of people. All of this being done to supply workers for the plantation agriculture economy that was being developed in the Americas to grow raw materials and foodstuffs to send back. And then the second part here is talking about how the movement of enslaved peoples changed the nature of slavery, and I'm going to talk to that, but again, that's one of the areas I want to add a slide or two on, and the fact that the form of slavery that emerged in the Americas had kind of a profound effect on the social order in the Americas for until now. Still, we're still grappling with that today. So I've talked a few times about like enter the modern world. Well, this is another one of those examples. So like I said, the Indian Ocean Trade Network already existed. We learned about that in Unit 2. So it's a well-established, well-oiled machine at this point. But the Europeans enter the scene. So their arrival disrupts some things. In other words, their military presence, the presence of these armed ships, which were not being used by the merchants that existed throughout here, had an impact. In other words, the Europeans were able to seize things, they were able to engage in piracy, and they were able to control trade networks quite literally. So that restructures some of the relationships. But despite all of this chaos, understand that trade continued to flourish. That includes, like I said earlier, for the local rulers. Okay, everyone was benefiting from all this trade except the people that were being, let's say, enslaved, for instance. That's obviously one clear example. But also the people that were maybe supporting the industries in, lower end jobs. They probably weren't having a very good time either. But the merchants and the trading class certainly was. The College Board wants you to know about these 4 groups, okay, that were 4 of the existing groups. That's why they're noteworthy. So the first there you can see Swahili Arabs. That's what you would see here from Mombasa. Remember, this is the Swahili coast, okay? Mombasa wasn't the only city. Okay, you got Kilwa, Sofala, Zanzibar. There's a bunch of cities here, but Mombasa is one of them. So this here is that Swahili coast. That's where the Swahili Arabs or the Swahili merchants would be based out of. The next name you see listed there are the Omanis, so that's Hormuz we're looking at here. Okay, that's an important group that relations were an important existing trading group that had relations with European trade networks, essentially, is what we're talking about here. The Gujaratis, remember the Gujarat kingdom, or I think that was the kingdom, yeah, sorry. Kingdom, empire, sultanate, we use these words a lot, so sometimes I even kind of get them confused. But remember that the Gujarat kingdom, I believe it was, in western India, centered around Calcutta or Calicut. And then the last one to know about would be the Javanese, not the Javanese. No, let me fix that. The Javanese, which were in Southeast Asia, and the Spice Islands. Sorry. So we're talking about over here, like Malacca and the surrounds over here. Okay, so those are the groups you need to know. Guangzhou should make sense because it's part of China, but that's the network we're talking about. You also need to understand the idea of isolationism. Okay, isolationism is just the idea of a country trying to maintain a certain separate identity from the rest of the world and not directly participating in globalism. The map that I'm showing you there are not East Asian empires at all. But what I want to point out is you might notice where these lines don't go, right? So there's lines everywhere. The Europeans are doing all kinds of stuff here, and even through here, right? The Europeans are active, and then they're crossing the Pacific too. It's amazing. However, none of those lines are going up here. The reason that those lines are not going up there is because the Chinese and the Japanese were not receptive to them. In other words, particularly the Japanese, were aggressively anti-European influence, okay? So you need to know about both of these examples. So remember we talked about the voyages of Zheng He and how he had that the fleet that was that brief period where the Ming Dynasty tried to reassert Chinese dominance after their reconquest against the Yuan Dynasty and their Mongol rulers. So they had that brief little period where they did some exploring and they were engaged with particularly East Africa at that time. But when that stopped, which was very shortly after the Ming Dynasty started, they returned to a isolationist posture, which has been pretty much true of China throughout a great deal of its history. So it would engage at the edges with trade with the outside world. In other words, it would trade with the outside world, but wouldn't let the outside world in, essentially. So that had to be kind of done at the door. The Japanese did a similar thing. They actually had a whole trading island that they set up where they would only trade with eventually the Dutch. But initially they actually did engage with the Portuguese, but as you see there, they had an influx of Christianity into Japan, and that influx of Christianity basically threatened or challenged the Buddhist order that existed there. And so they outlawed Christianity, they ended up executing people, and they more or less kicked Christianity out of the country. And from that time onward, we're very clear that they did not want that European influence in their country. They wanted to be left to their own affairs because they prioritized stability above all else. So they saw this as only chaos that was coming in. Labor systems, next thing to talk about. So, like I said before, it's a little counterintuitive, but overall, the African population improved during this time. But in West Africa, that was not necessarily the case. Okay, so you had huge populations being exported essentially as enslaved people to supply this triangular trade system. Remember, triangular trade is very tied up with mercantilism. All right, if these states are competing with each other in a zero-sum game where they just need to get more stuff than the other states, part of the reason that they were willing to engage in this terrible trade of enslaved people that was going on was, part of it was certainly racist and seeing themselves as dominant. Part of it was rooted in some very silly notions that were being pulled from the Bible. But a big part of it was just rooted in the need for people to exploit the newly conquered land for the benefit of the mother country. Okay, so remember, they felt huge pressure from each other to outdo each other. So essentially, once this ball gets rolling, once they start engaging in this, it's almost like a mad rush to outdo each other because they need to be able to extract more from the colonies that they've created. You need to know about coerced labor systems. That just means forced labor systems that were present in the Americas. So Mita is the first one to know. That was an Inca system. And with that system, everyone in the Inca Empire, this predates the Spanish arrival, okay, so this is a pre-existing system that the Spanish then just continued using, but kind of in a worse way, of course. So under the Inca Empire, everyone that lived in that empire had to, every so many years, give some time to the empire, to the state of their labor. It was essentially taxes that were paid in the form of labor. The Spanish then came in and used that system to supply workers for the silver mines. A big reason they did that is because the silver mining was very dangerous and they just really needed bodies essentially to throw at it, so they forced people in that way. You had the encomienda system, which was actually brought across from Spain, and it was kind of like an indentured servitude merged with feudalism in kind of a way where you had grants over specific territories, and that's very similar to the hacienda system, which was grants of specific land territories. And so in both of these, you had control over specific areas, but in encomienda, the person that was given control over that local territory then also had control over the indigenous populations that were living there. And there was a forcing of conversion to Christianity, and then if people wouldn't convert to Christianity, they were then essentially slaves, but not really, right? Because they were they weren't owned, but they had no rights. So, the last one you see there is chattel slavery. That was the outright ownership of people, and that was really just a feature of the African trade, the trade of enslaved Africans that developed as the need for more workers in the Americas grew. But a point to make from the CED that I just want to touch on real quick is that the nature of slavery from Africa changed. So you might remember that when I talked about this in class, I was focused on blame, right? I was saying that, historically there's been a lot of whitewashing that goes on to say, well, wait a second, like the Europeans were just buying from a slave market that already existed. Essentially, the African slave trade existed without Europeans, so you can't really blame the Europeans for it being what it was. Well, there's a few flaws there. One, what it meant to be a slave in Africa was different. In other words, it wasn't really seen as the ownership of people. And a lot of times, slaves in Africa, the ones that were bought and sold within Africa, were more or less treated as a part of the family. Now, don't get me wrong, they were not treated well. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it either. But what I'm getting at was they weren't seen as property to be owned. They were seen as people that you had rights over their labor, essentially. But they were still seen as people, and they were still treated as people. And to an extent, they were still cared for as people. It wasn't until the Europeans add this kind of layer of racial superiority into that existing system that you see the concept of the ownership of people as property becoming a thing. And that changes the nature of it because it dehumanizes it. In other words, that's how you have boats of humans just being packed full of as many people as you could possibly fit and being brought across the ocean where 20% of people on the ship would die along the way. And there was just no concern for their well-being whatsoever because they were seen as property on par with the cattle. And so that's the difference. Okay, yes, there was an existing slave trade in Africa. There certainly was. Europeans increased that demand. They led to the conquering of groups by other groups just for the accumulation of people to sell. So they increased it as well. But yes, they did enter an existing market. But what they did with that market was different. What they did once they made their purchase was different to what was going on not domestically, but in Africa at the time. So I just want to kind of explain that relationship because it's complicated. It really is. This is the last of the slides for now. So, like I said before, despite that devastating impact, overall, Africa did thrive during this time. You need to know about those two states that I mentioned earlier. When I say know about them, I really kind of just mean know about them. You don't need to get into too much detail here, but both of them did engage in trade with Europeans. They did so more than some of their counterparts, and that gave them an advantage because they had the influx of not only wealth and capital, but also influx of technology that allowed them to then have a competitive advantage over their rivals around them and allowed them to grow into larger, more powerful states. So there's just a couple examples. You can see actually there from Freemanpedia, he's added a couple others as well. Let me see. Oh yeah, see he says the ones that are specifically mentioned by College Board. The Songhai are as well. They're just not a part of this part, but they are mentioned by the College Board. But also the Jollof and Benin. So there are a couple others you should know about. But that is it, guys.